Welcome to Frontline Dispatches and Organizing Upgrade, a show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent organizing and activism happening around the country and beyond, for racial and economic justice and much more. You can tune in for future episodes of Frontline Dispatches every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific. My name is Gerald Lenoir, and I'm your host today. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those as the program goes on. If you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like and subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to speed on all of the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. So let's get started. Today I'll be discussing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and Palestinian freedom with Lara Kiswani, Executive Director of the Arab Resource Organizing Committee, or AROC. AROC serves poor and working class Arabs and Muslims across San Francisco Bay Area and organizes to overturn racism, forced migration, and militarism. Lara is from Bet Iska Akir, Palestine, and was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's been active in the movements against racism and war, for Palestinian self-determination and international solidarity for the last 20 years. In 2016, Lara represented her community as part of the historic Black and Indigenous delegation to Palestine. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches, Lara.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's good to see you. You know, it's been a decade since I led the Eyewitness Palestine's first African Heritage delegation to Palestine and Israel. There have been a lot of developments since then, and I'd like to start by asking about what's been going on the ground in Palestine and Israel, especially your read on the Palestinian movement's new stage of resistance. Tell us about what you understand about who's organizing the resistance and what their strategy is.
You know, what we're seeing right now in Palestine essentially is a united front of sorts within and all over across historic Palestine. In terms of who's organizing and who is mobilizing at the moment, it's a mix of civil society organizations, unorganized people and communities, and political parties. And obviously it was sparked in large part in May, but the resistance that we all have witnessed since May was not led by one organization. It was in many ways an organic response to the conditions on the ground, the over 73 years of settler colonial violence, compounded by the month of Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan. And so what we often witness during the month of Ramadan is an intensification of Israeli violence. And once again, we witnessed that. But the response from the grassroots, from communities of Palestinians across all of historic Palestine, was quite unprecedented, right? At the same time, the people of Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem, were organizing international resistance to the forced expulsions that they were being subjugated to, both by police-backed armed settlers as well as the Israeli military itself. And it started to put to question, essentially put to question the entire logic of settler colonialism and the laws that enforce them. So the fact that the people of Jerusalem were protesting these forced evictions and the people all across occupied Palestine were joining them in that resistance, and at the same time, the center of gravity for this was all in Jerusalem, and Israel continued to escalate the violence there. But what's important to name is, in this time period where there was, forced expulsions, being attempted, as well as ongoing violence against Al-Aqsa, the mosque in Jerusalem, while people are praying there, on the night of power is what we call it, May 10th. Over 90,000 Palestinians went to pray in Al-Aqsa, right? Amidst over 90,000 people. And the very next morning, we witnessed, what we saw was that Israel attacked people in Al-Aqsa mosque. They stormed the mosque. And time again, it's shown that anytime Israel does, attacks Al-Aqsa mosque or attacks Jerusalem, widespread resistance will follow. And that's exactly what we saw. But what's unique about this moment is that it's not people of the West Bank. It's not the people in Gaza. It's not the people in occupied Palestine 48, which is now known as the State of Israel, it wasn't just the people of Jerusalem, it was all of them united in resistance and actually defying borders, defying checkpoints, defying the attempts to also fragment society. And we saw people, just to give you some example of what it looked like and what was happening, Palestinians were setting fire to police vehicles and stations in Jerusalem, in Lid, in Kafr Qasim, in Al-Fahim, in my mother's village, Aqir, and Rahat. All of these are have been declared since 1948, part of Israel proper, right? Palestinians disrupted the railway line between Lid and Tel Aviv. In Lid, Israel essentially lost all control of the city for the first time since 1948, and temporarily Palestinians liberated it, right? In Haifa, the people that were resisting were actually covering the roads with soap and water to make it slippery for the armed militias and settlers that were coming to attack them, right? And in the West Bank, from Nablus, Hebron, Jenin, Palestinian, and Ramallah, Palestinians were marching to checkpoints. And so all of that culminated with May 18th, which was that strike of what was called the general strike, or the strike of dignity and hope. And the slogan for that strike was, and what was written in all the pamphlets, is it is time for the Nakba not to continue, right? So we often say in the Palestinian community, the Nakba continues. It started in 48, the Nakba meaning the catastrophe, right? The occupation and the creation of the State of Israel and the occupation of Palestine. And we often say that never stopped because settler colonial violence continues. Settler colonialism continues in occupied Palestine. But the slogan in the pamphlets here were that it's time for the Nakba to end, essentially. It's time for it not to continue. So this was really, I think, for us Palestinians in diaspora, Palestinians everywhere, really understood this as this new round of resistance as truly unprecedented, but an unprecedented victory. It was actually a victory in of itself. It's still a victory in of itself. So despite the billions of dollars that have gone into fracturing Palestinian national liberation movement, attempting to physically and politically separate us, whether that's in the occupied territories in 1948, in Gaza, the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the prisons, refugee camps, in diaspora. Really, the current resistance in Palestine has been a victory against apartheid Israel and US imperialism and its functionaries, including that of the Palestinian Authority, right, who are continuing to cage our people and assassinate our leaders. So the goal, I would say, I think essentially is to end settler colonialist rule and domination. And by mobilizing segments of Palestinian society all over and across geography, our people are actually actively demonstrating decolonization. And, as a reminder, I think everyone listening knows this, but very simply put, the people in Palestine and the people of Palestine, we're defending our land, our homes, against one of the largest militaries in the world, backed by the largest military in the world, that being the United States. So this is no small feat, what we're describing here in terms of the growth of the resistance across all of historic Palestine.
Yes, and we're seeing a blackout now in the news about it. It was at its peak in May, and now we see very little about what's going on in Palestine. I presume that the resistance is still continuing, but we don't hear a lot about it in the mainstream media, at least.
Well, often, when there's no spectacle of violence in the media, people assume that nothing's actually happening in Palestine, and obviously that's not the case, and that's not the case anywhere, really, because the institutions of racism and the ongoing violence that Palestinians are facing continues. And just as the violence continues, so too does the resistance. And especially in recent days, we've seen the Palestinian Authority arrest many of our activists who are outspoken leaders, and also kill one of the most outspoken leaders against the Palestinian Authority, which has also sparked new waves of resistance to really expose the relationship not only between Israel and the PA, but also the PA, Israel, the other, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, and the relationships that are actually making it possible for this suffering to continue.
So give us a snapshot of what's going on in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign and the Palestinian solidarity movement. Has it been able to match the intensity of what's going on in Palestine?
Well, I don't think that BDS in of itself can ever match the intensity of what's going on in Palestine. That being said, BDS is gaining a lot of traction, and there's been tremendous progress in its goal, right? Its intended goal, which is to isolate Israel economically, politically, and culturally. And arguably, we're seeing very much of that in terms of the mass consciousness and also the consensus across social justice movements about what is or isn't the state of Israel, and how does it function and what role does it play. One of the most recent victories was Ben & Jerry's, which for many years activists have been organizing to stop them from agreeing to work with to actually sell and produce ice cream in settlements. So this was a huge victory for the very fact that it took so many years for them to do so, and they finally did so now, right? There's also the African Union that granted Israeli observer status. That could seem like a defeat, but ultimately the mass resistance and opposition to that decision is clearly an indication of the widespread support for Palestine globally and in Africa, the African continent. Norway's largest pension fund excluded 16 companies because of their links to Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. And then also we all know about the groundbreaking Human Rights Watch report, which basically called Israel an apartheid state. And 10 former presidents, more than 700 members of parliament, mayors, public officials, and academics from Latin America, from Asia, from the African continent called on the United Nations to recognize Israel as an apartheid state and to impose sanctions on it. So really using the S in BDS, which is often not something that was leveraged against Israel. And then also there's unprecedented support today from labor unions. They're issuing statements in support of BDS. They're taking action. During May, the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza put out a call for solidarity from workers across the world to not handle Israeli goods, to boycott Israel in their workplaces, and to build solidarity with workers in Palestine. That call was met with widespread support. I mean, here in the Bay Area, we led the Block the Boat campaign, renewed the call from 2014, where we successfully stopped the largest Israeli shipping line, Zim, from docking at the port of Oakland. It hadn't come since, 7 years and counting, and then it attempted to dock again in June of this year. We put out the call, and labor did not cross the picket. ILW did not cross the picket. And then people mobilized all across North America and Italy and South Africa to also block Israeli ships and Israeli cargo successfully. So I think this is all an indication of where we're at in terms of BDS, and people understanding also worker struggle as instrumental in that. Historically, it wasn't during apartheid South Africa, but also there's ways in which people are also challenging attempts at pinkwashing, greenwashing, or whitewashing Israeli atrocities that have become so normal over the last several decades. And that, I think, is another indication that there's true strength and solidarity that is growing in movements, and understanding the exploitation of Palestinians and dispossession of Palestinians as connected to the struggle of all people. And there's a responsibility of international society to take some action. And lastly, I'll just say that, as we think about the U.S.-Israeli partnership and movements to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, we are also seeing many ways in which governments across the world are also calling on sanctions against Israel, or not denormalizing relations with Israel. Now, we may not see that happen here in the U.S., but for that reason, the work of civil society here in the U.S., of the grassroots and movements to continue to engage in BDS, is essential if we are going to continue to isolate Israel as needed in order to be able to strengthen and support the movement on the ground in Palestine.
In a minute, we're going to take a question from someone that's watching us, but let me just ask you this. You mentioned some of the advances in the movement. And we know that over the past few years, a broader but still small group of organizers have embraced international solidarity and anti-imperialism. And many more sectors of the movement are clear about the need to build a broad movement to defend democracy and advance racial justice. So how have these developments in the movement impacted the solidarity struggle for a free Palestine?
Yeah, as I was mentioning a second ago, the ability for us to increase the isolation of apartheid Israel politically, economically, and culturally actually strengthens liberation movement for Palestine, right? Because it widens our reach and also deepens our impact, both on the ground and in diaspora. And I would say that, essentially Palestine has become a wedge issue. We are looking at movements in motion right now, and what is your position on Palestine has become a key question for everyone that, is working towards, social or economic justice. And that position is becoming more tightly woven into people's agendas, right? And we see this with Movement for Black Lives. We saw this at Standing Rock. We're seeing it across trade unions like ILWU. And then given Israel's longstanding efforts to whitewash its human rights abuses and its positions in progressive spaces in particular, it's especially significant today that progressives and working class movements are recognizing Palestine as central to any social justice issue. They're recognizing the contradictions. While Israel presents itself as a beacon for democracy, they're law state, they're not a state of its citizens. They're a state for the Jewish people, relegating Palestinians to second and third class citizenship, right? Israel presents itself as a leader in green energy while it continues to pollute Palestinian land, planting invasive species, building ecological preserves to cover up ethnically cleansed areas and villages, right? So all of this is really starting to unravel in terms of contributing to rupturing Zionist hegemony, but also strengthening all social justice movements, right? That's why I think at the end of the day, when we think about, in essence, like calling on an end to U.S. aid to Israel actually emboldens local calls here to defund police and invest in communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about shifting the political and economic priorities of this government. So the billions that go into apartheid regime that are used to prop up, legal and social apartheid regime to kill our people, right? If we can transfer that into actually prioritizing the well-being of people and thinking about that as an agenda for all of us, then really challenging challenging Israel and apartheid Israel, putting an end to apartheid Israel, is a contribution to all social justice movements, because it's also a contribution to the movement against U.S. imperialism and shifting the economic and political priorities of this government.
There you go. There you go. I'm going to take a question from our audience. Can we show it up on the screen? Thank you, Laura. For those who don't know, can you please explain what happened during the 1948 Nakba and the importance of right to return?
Thanks for raising that. So in this year this is the 73rd year of the colonization of Palestine, of the Nakba, which, was in May 1948. And my father, for instance, is older than the state of Israel. He was 10 years old at the time. And many of our grandparents and parents and family members, are older than the state itself. So the creation of the state of Israel resulted in over 750,000 refugees, Palestinian refugees, who now make up 7.5 million refugees globally. And under international law, we have the right to return to our homelands and to our villages, which Israel refuses to acknowledge. And that is one of the key tenets of the Palestinian liberation movement is, with the creation of the state of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the dispossession and the expulsion of Palestinians from our original land. The struggle is not only to end the apartheid regime, which creates a discriminatory and racist legal system against different people in all of historic Palestine. It's not only to end the militarism, right? It's the military occupation of the West Bank. It's not only to stop the blockade of Gaza, but it's also to the right of return for all of us refugees to go back to our original homeland. And that is a key tenet of our struggle and is one of the tenets of also the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement.
Thank you for that question. Lara, I wanted to ask again about the social movements in the U.S. What do you think are the capacity and outlooks that we still need to develop to better contribute to the struggle for Palestinian liberation?
To contribute to the struggle for Palestinian liberation, everyone in the U.S. has to understand better, have a deeper, better, stronger analysis of U.S. imperialism and its impacts and implications for the world. Right? So to understand Palestine, to contribute to the struggle of Palestine, we have to deepen our commitment to internationalism, to anti-imperialism. We must understand U.S. imperialism is one of the primary contradictions of our time and our movements. And we must support movements for self-determination and against U.S. intervention everywhere, right? So including Haiti, Cuba, to the Philippines, and Palestine. All of that is what really, that internationalist political project is what will contribute to the liberation of Palestine, because inherently that's what the liberation of Palestine is about, right? And that's what it's rooted in, and that's the tradition it comes from. I would also just say that is lacking, right? So internationalism and understand of U.S. imperialism is not something that historically has been quite clear to U.S. social movements, or a priority for many U.S. social movements. Is often quite siloed, and that is the task at hand today. And I think we are seeing, especially given what we've seen with the global pandemic and how it exposed the global nature of all our struggles. We can't actually understand ourselves as just fighting for in a local terrain within the United States, that our struggles actually against racial capitalism and exploitation, against U.S. imperialism are all connected, and that is really the way we're going to overturn these systems, is to understand their interconnectedness, just like our adversaries understand that very well. We too must start to move in that direction.
I totally agree with that, Laura. I come out of the immigrant rights movement, and the immigrant rights movement has not embraced the Palestinian struggle and the way that it has embraced other refugee communities. And I think that that's a struggle to get out of that silo and to really bring these social movements together is really critical to the whole project of dismantling imperialism and creating democracy in this country. Another question for you is, our left and progressive organizations are building not only electoral capacity, but also the capacity to eventually govern. I'd like to know what you think about our ability to pursue a pro-Palestinian liberation agenda through formal channels in Congress.
I would argue that many, if not most, in our movement today are saying that the changes we're seeing in Congress as it relates to Palestine are unprecedented. There was a time when the word Palestine or Palestinian was taboo, to the point where if would reach the headlines in Arab media if it was mentioned, or political careers would be sabotaged as a result. Today, people are challenging the criminalization of BDS. Even more so, they're talking about sanctions. They're talking about the S in BDS, and ultimately, they are also there's also policies and bills being passed or attempted to be passed to actually restrict funds to Israel, right? But at the same time, we can't kid ourselves. Like, these types of moves are not gaining the widest support in Congress, right? But the changes are still significant. And they're only made possible by mass movements. So in large part, I would argue by the movement for Black lives and Indigenous water protectors, forcing new conversations about racial and economic justice, and also the political priorities of this government. So I think we should continue to put pressure and on electeds, and we can and should to do so, to challenge and isolate apartheid Israel. But it's a duty, especially here in the United States, given we're a primary funder of the state of Israel. And I think our, AROC and all our national partners, including like the Rising Majority, are constantly assessing legislative and electoral strategy, not just as it relates to Palestine, but broadly speaking, as it relates to a anti-capitalist, anti-militarism, anti-racist agenda. And we don't have all the answers, but one thing is quite clear, is that the U.S. military budget must be taken up as a priority for us as it relates to the work we're doing in Congress for all social justice movements, for all political programs. And, we have seen a significant increase in the amount of organizations embracing abolition and anti-Zionism, challenging both racial capitalism and patriarchal violence. And I think there's a lot of potential for us to also continue to advance movements that also have, some impact within Congress, but it'll be slow moving. And that is to be expected, but we also cannot underestimate what we're seeing today and how significant it is given the history of the work on Palestine as it relates to Congress in the United States.
So you mentioned your alliance with Black Lives Matter and with the water protectors. Can you talk a little bit about those kind of cross-movement and cross-racial alliance building that you've been a part of?
Well, I was saying earlier that the Palestinian, the left Palestinian movement is internationalist inherently, comes from a tradition of third world struggle and connections to other movements, including indigenous movements of Turtle Island, as well as the Black freedom struggle. And, AROC also very much is committed to internationalism and understands, even as you were describing in terms of migrant justice, we do work around migration and migrant justice as well. And it's always important for us to frame that within forced migration, right? And the freedom for people to move, stay, and return. And so all of that really, I think for us is the framework for which lays the foundation for our joint struggle work with other movements. We understand our liberation as not only connected, but our liberation is only going to be made possible through solidarity and through joint struggle. So we are part of the Rising Majority, which is a Black-led national coalition aimed at putting forward a political program, a new political agenda for progressive movements, for left movements here in the United States, so that we can gain power, that we can build our power, and that we can shift the political and economic priorities of this country. And it's a long-term strategy and a long-term project, but it's only made possible through cross-movement building. And it must be not seen as a transactional, right? So when we say cross-movement building, and I know you know this very well, it's not a transaction, right? It's about solidarity is necessary to win, because inherently our oppression isn't all that we have in common. It's also our liberation and our futures.
Yes, thank you for that. So as you know, the threat from the far right is very real, and a really strong effort to derail democracy. And this coalition on the right really is pushing to regain governing power in 2022 in Congress. What are the implications of this for the ability to fight for a free Palestine, and what does this imply about our strategy for solidarity going forward in the U.S.?
Well, I think widened capacity for the right here in the U.S. will obviously embolden global authoritarianism and fascism, and in particular embolden the apartheid government of Israel. And as anti-racist and anti-capitalist, as those who are fighting for a true democracy, we have to confront these different forces all at once and understand that we're taking on neoliberalism, we're taking on racial capitalism, but we're also having to, contend with the rise of fascism and the radicalized right. And we know that the right's agenda ultimately will have a decades-long impact, right? So what we've seen in recent years has not disappeared and will not disappear, but it's also a response to our movements, right? Their agenda is in direct response to our movements and will continue to attempt to repress our capacity to build power and to build a left political project. So, essentially in order to do so, I would just echo that we need to resist the siloing of our movements and understand the interconnectedness of our work. We need to work towards a shared agenda, a liberatory agenda and strategy. And solidarity. It's necessary for us to win, in the same way that the global working class has always borne the brunt of state violence. Our emancipatory visions and projects will mean the capacity for everyone's freedom, right? And in that light, also solidarity with Palestine builds power for all international movements for justice. So, as we see the far right gain traction, I think it means it's that much more critical that we start to build a strong left to be able to contend with the forces that will be committed to ongoing desecration of this planet, but also the suffering of working people across the world.
Lara Kiswani of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, thank you for your words of wisdom and the work that you do. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have, unfortunately. And I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
To our audience, if you enjoyed this video, please stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade. Sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Thank you for joining us. And if you like what you heard, please join us next week, same day, Wednesday, at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific. Take care.